Joining me once again, as he does often, Gabe Ortiz of Daily Kos, who covers immigration, Latino issues, a whole bunch of issues that we talk about on the program regularly, and always great to have him on the show. Welcome back, Gabe.
Hey, Mike. Great to chat, like always.
So we were just talking about this, demonization we're seeing of immigrants with regard to COVID now. Newt Gingrich sitting on Maria Bartiromo's show, and she's saying, in addition to throwing out all of their white supremacist stuff, they're throwing in, these people are coming across the border with COVID, and if we were really concerned about COVID, we'd stop the border, shut the border. And you hear this over and over. And you and I talked about how in Texas, it wasn't the immigrants. They were overwhelmingly vaccinated. It's Texans, of course, who are transmitting, white Texans, I should say, who are transmitting coronavirus. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, because we even have somebody on the line who's saying, how do you know immigrants aren't coming across the border with COVID? And you, in fact, covered Greg Abbott pushing this executive order on the transportation of migrants, perpetuating this immigrants bring disease kind of trope, using that as the reasoning. Talk a little bit about it.
Sure. And actually, in addition to Newt Gingrich, Ron DeSantis earlier today made the same kind of claim about immigrants supposedly bringing over disease. And I feel like they do this when they know they're feeling a lot of heat. And when there's trouble, they know they go immediately to blaming immigrants because they know it's something's happening that looks bad on them. Look, the data that we're seeing out of Texas, in one of the largest migrant shelters in Texas, close to 90% of families that are coming through are accepting the vaccine. That's almost 90%. I mean, if you look at among Texans within the last couple of weeks, it's been around 40-something, 42% are taking the vaccine. So, we know that there's nothing here. This whole attack on immigrants is just usual part of this anti-immigrant playbook. And actually, within the last couple of days, the Biden administration is reportedly looking at a plan to implement the vaccines along the entire border, because right now most of the vaccines are being distributed by the shelters themselves. So the Biden administration is now looking at taking on that responsibility itself. So we could see even more vaccines going out right now.
And we have more than enough vaccine. The problem is that many Americans do not want to take the vaccine, but many migrants are happy to take the vaccine. So they're not bringing coronavirus. Coronavirus is exploding in this country because a lot of right-wing propaganda has been fed into the brains of these people, and conspiracy theories from QAnon and elsewhere about taking the vaccine.
And I have no doubt that if the Biden administration does do its own vaccination plan, that the same folks who have been railing against the vaccine and who have tried to discourage it are now going to be angry that migrants as asylum seekers are happily taking it. So, mark my words. Be on the lookout.
Well, I actually said a little while ago, this might be a good strategy to get all these other people vaccinated. If suddenly they see people they think who shouldn't be getting the vaccine are getting it, you're taking my vaccine, then maybe they'll get it.
And, it seems like if there's enough for everybody, hey, go for it.
Right. There's a new report from the Government Accountability Office that says federal immigration officials may have deported as many as 70 U.S. citizens during the past 5 years in the zealous years, of course, of deportations. 800 other possible U.S. citizens were either arrested or detained in that time period. And we've spoken about some of these cases before. Tell us more about ICE's pattern of profiling and racism that has resulted in this.
Exactly. As you just mentioned, we've seen individual cases over the last few years of U.S. citizens being detained by ICE. The government watchdog's own report here says that ICE has not only detained hundreds of U.S. citizens over the last 5 years, but has deported as many as 70 during that time. We've known from the prior reporting that U.S. citizens who have been detained have tried to show documentation that they're citizens, and officers have either said they're fakes or have delayed their release for weeks at a time. In one man's case in New York, he was detained for 3 years, basically because he had no outside help to get that documentation to ICE. For 3 years, he was detained. And because of the statute of limitations, he couldn't sue. Another really disturbing finding from this report is that because ICE has always been so bad at record keeping, these numbers may be even higher. It's just a matter of ICE didn't bother to note that they were American citizens.
Yeah, and it's they don't care because it's not about that. It's about racism, right? That's really what it is.
Exactly. And, the problem is that, they're required to go through processes, to go through their paperwork. They don't do it, and nothing ever happens to them in terms of, congressional oversight, in terms of their funding being restricted. They just continue on these racial profiling campaigns, because that's what they do. They single out primarily Latino and Black people and accuse them of not being American citizens.
Yesterday, we saw the second anniversary of the El Paso shooting, the mass shooting in the Walmart parking lot, killed 23 people, injuring many others. Joe Biden wrote an op-ed sounding the alarm about white supremacist violence. I believe Donald Trump incited that attack. There's no question. Talk a little bit about that and how it just reminds us of the white supremacist threat that we're continuing to see, and how it's still connected to Donald Trump.
Sure. I think some really heartfelt and urgent words that we heard from the president and other leaders in the state, like Veronica Escobar, who represents Texas, and Julian Castro, remembering these 23 people who were murdered, and honoring the resilience of this community. But as you mentioned, there was also a lot of urgency because, as the president said in his statement, especially, it was domestic terrorism rooted in white supremacy that led to this. And that's still the biggest threat that we're seeing to our nation. It's not asylum seekers. It's not undocumented immigrants. It's white domestic terrorism. And, just look at January 6th. There's a direct line there of the right-wing rhetoric that eventually turns into physical violence. And Republican leaders, especially from Texas, they know this, and they're still refusing to stop this rhetoric. I think that's what continues to make El Paso really difficult to heal from, is because we know that invasion rhetoric, the kind that we've heard from the former president, is what led to this. And
that is what motivated the shooter, and that came from Donald Trump. Yeah,
and we're still seeing that kind of rhetoric today from the governor. And
when we saw the 4 officers who testified at the Select Committee, Police Sergeant Gunnell recounted the insurrectionists telling him he was not even an American. He is Latino. He is an American. And it just, again, connected the racist attacks that these police officers endured and this whole movement, as you just said, January 6th, tied to it, and the white supremacy.
That testimony was just so, gut-wrenching and infuriating because, especially that of the officers of color, because they received this really horrible racist abuse in addition to the physical physical violence. Officer Gonell, he testified he's a U.S. military veteran, officer of many years, and yet he was told by these insurrectionists that he was not an American. He's a naturalized citizen of 20 years, served in the military. They couldn't even have told you, the insurrectionists have told you his first name, and yet they looked at his skin color and said that he was not patriotic and he was not an American. And meanwhile, they were the ones there trying to overturn democracy. It was just infuriating and just so really heartbreaking to listen to him, to listen to his testimony, I think in particular.
Yeah, and it again just underscored the ties to all of these groups and what Donald Trump is fomenting and continues to foment. Now, I wanted to ask you. I'm sorry. Go on.
No, still. I mean, there was the horrible another suicide just a couple days ago. So we're still among an officer. So We're still seeing this. I think this domestic terrorism still continue to play out.
You and I have talked about the fate of interpreters in Afghanistan who had worked with American soldiers, and how vulnerable they were to the Taliban, and how that fate was up in the air as the U.S. is drawing down. But we've now seen the first group of Afghan allies who aided the military arrive in the U.S. The president eventually made this a priority. Talk a little bit about Operation Allies Refuge.
Sure, and there was actually a lot of news in the last couple of days about our Afghan allies, and really a lot of the realization of efforts that have been going back for months now from advocates. As you mentioned, the very first group of Afghan allies and their families arrived to Fort Lee in Virginia, about 200 people so far, and we're expecting as many as 2,500 to come through Fort Lee. That same week, Congress and the president signed into law legislation that that speeds up the processing, application process, and that increases visas by 8,000. So that was a huge victory right there, a huge win. And then this week, the administration said that it was expanding who's eligible to be relocated. So, currently it's, translators, people who work directly with the military. Now it's also being expanded to allies who worked in the media and non-governmental organizations, and who are now in danger due to Taliban forces. So that could affect about another 1,000 people. So there's some really significant life-saving changes here. And I think right now what advocates are most focused on is continuing to try to get as many of these allies to either the U.S. or U.S. territory, because many may be sent to a third country to wait processing, but there's no guarantee of their safety there. So there is a push right now to keep trying to get as many of these allies here to the U.S. As possible. And as we're seeing people going to Fort Lee, we're seeing that it is possible to do that.
Yeah, and that's really great to see. And that came because a lot of people spoke up. One thing we've learned about this administration is that if a lot of people speak up, things happen. Not always, but things do happen.
Exactly, yeah.
President Biden also stated his support for passing a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and temporary status holders, essential workers in the budget reconciliation package. And we've talked about this. Talk a little bit more about what movement we're seeing now among Democrats and the White House to really make this part of the package.
And that was actually the second time in about a month that the president explicitly said that he was in support of visa and reconciliation. The vice president has supported it as well publicly. Democratic lawmakers met with the president last week on the subject, and it seems to me like they made it very clear that reconciliation is the best chance in years to pass legalization for these communities. The House has passed legislation 2 sessions in a row And it's, just like then, it's still getting stuck in the House. In the Senate due to the 60-vote threshold. So, we are still waiting to hear word from the parliamentarian, what their opinion is on this.
And I think we really have to push the idea that the parliamentarian works for the party. And they need to make the parliament, fire the parliamentarian if the parliamentarian says no. This would be huge to have in that bill, and Americans support it. You write about a recent Data for Progress poll that shows passing citizenship in the reconciliation package is overwhelmingly popular.
70% of Americans overall. It's really, really high with Democrats and independents. With Republicans, it's a little more than half. But overall, across party lines, it is overwhelmingly popular. It's just a matter of, do Democrats have the will to really stand up here and finally get this done? And, in the end, whether it's, through reconciliation, overruling the parliamentarian if necessary, it's the vice president who makes the 51st vote here. So, if Democrats really, really, get down to it, they can pass this.
And the poll really shows us just how much the media distorts this issue. Republicans grab onto this issue because, as we discussed earlier, it's their go-to when they're really desperate. It doesn't often help them. It's often a big loser, and this poll is one reason why. And yet the media blows it up as some sort of potent weapon that Republicans have, right?
And especially on the issue of DACA recipients, it is such a consistently popular polling item for years now. It has always been consistently popular, and it's still getting framed as something that's, very controversial. The media quotes anti-immigrant hate groups. That's what they have to stoop to in order to find people who oppose it. It's overwhelmingly popular.
All right. Gabe, always great to have you on the program. So glad we can get to all of these issues. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Mike.
Gabe Ortiz of Daily Kos. Read his work on Daily Kos, where he is senior political writer, and also follow him on Twitter at Tusk81. We're back in a couple of minutes.
The Michelangelo Signorile Show.